Hello, everybody. My name is Olivia Mattis, and on behalf of the Humanities Institute at Stony Brook and our director, Ann Kaplan, I would like to welcome all of you to a very special installment of our ongoing series called In Dialogue, Interdisciplinary Perspectives. In this series, Stony Brook faculty from divergent disciplines come together to address and debate an issue of common interest and concern. In the process, the audience learns not only about the subject at hand, but also about the different methods and approaches from one discipline to another. Today's event is organized by Professor Paul Bingham in biology. Its title is Humanities, Social Sciences, and Human Evolutionary Biology, Three Facets of the Same Enterprise. Paul has asked me to request that you all pull out your cell phones and turn them off at this point. I also want to mention that there will be a reception after the event, and you are all cordially invited to attend. At this point, I will turn the podium over to the organizer, Paul Bingham, and he will introduce himself, his co-presenters, and today's event. Thank you.
Thank you, Olivia. I should clarify, the four of us organized this as a collaborative event. It wasn't all or even mostly me. So, welcome to this Humanities Institute in Dialogue event. I'm Paul Bingham, biochemistry. I'm a molecular biologist by original training, but with a long-standing interest in human evolution. My colleagues include Joanne Souza, who's also in biochemistry, but a psychologist by original training, also with a long-standing interest in human evolution. Eva Kittay is a philosopher with a particular interest in the social and ethical roles of the disabled. And Pamela Block in the School of Health, Technology, and Management is a social scientist with a deep interest in disability studies. Though coming from diverse backgrounds, all four of us share a common interest in the connection between the humanities, the social sciences, and human evolution. Each of us will be speaking for about 10 minutes. We will then interact briefly amongst ourselves, and then we'd love to have you dive in and participate. Our journey will be built around an apparently narrow topic: how human societies deal with the ethical challenges that affect their most vulnerable members. However, like a pinhole in an opaque wall of ignorance, walking up closely to this ostensibly narrow topic allows us to peer through and view the larger human condition in an extensive and powerful new level of detail. It also helps us understand the disciplines in which we participate as students and faculty. The humanities, social sciences, and human evolutionary biology, the three legs of the human scholarship stool, so to speak, have matured to the point that we can begin to view them as different facets of the same scholarly endeavor. Indeed, for example, even the seemingly incommensurable epistemological positions of traditional postmodernists on the one hand and natural scientists on the other emerge as amenable to synthesis and resolution with minimal intellectual violence to the original positions. Shocking to those of you who occupy one or other of those positions as we speak. Moreover, the traditional tensions between individualism and collectivism come into sharp new focus. The scholarly and ethical implications of this unification are profound, and this little Venn-like diagram emphasizes why. As these formerly separate disciplines have grown and increased their insight and command, their areas of focus have begun to overlap. This moment of initial overlap is the era we now occupy. The question is, what does the future look like? Let's call this area of mutual overlap the human knowledge enterprise to distinguish it from the specialized disciplines making it up. This area constitutes a domain of massive inflow of information from each of the three disciplines into this common domain, producing a rapid new growth in understanding. Moreover, insights from this common domain flow back into the specialized domains, enriching them as well. This picture might seem a little artificial, Pollyannish, and naive, but in fact it's not. We know this because of the long history of human scholarship. Let me illustrate this with an example from the experience of recent enough that currently living scholars have experienced it. That's the growth, the emergence of contemporary biology. The growing together of chemistry, physics, and classical biology a generation ago created precisely this kind of common domain. And this domain grew stupendously and explosively over the last generation, as most of you know. Our current understanding of biology is literally orders of magnitude more sophisticated than it was just a couple of decades ago. In our remaining time today, we will try collectively to give you a feeling for how this exciting, powerfully productive unifying process is playing out in one particular context. My individual goal over the next few minutes is to outline one of the crucial ways in which one of these three disciplines, human evolution, has matured over the last decade, contributing to this confluence. Each subsequent speaker will briefly describe a selected feature of her own disciplinary interest, all of these stories speaking to the area of overlap between the three disciplines. In addition to our genetic and paleoanthropological insight in human evolution, we have broken new theoretical ground. And in particular, I will outline our contributions, that is Joanne and mine, to the development of what we will call social coercion theory. The question we have to address is sometimes called the human uniqueness question. We are massively different than the other great apes. A naive initial guess about our origins in relation to the other apes is to suppose that our lineage diverged from the lineage leading to the other apes long ago, thereby giving our ancestors a great deal of time to accumulate vast genetic differences distinguishing us from the other apes. However, molecular genetic analysis over the last generation has shown us decisively that this is not the answer. Rather, we are more closely related to chimps than chimps are to the other great apes. This tells us something of enormous importance. Humans became wildly different than the other great apes in a phenomenal hurry. Something changed profoundly in our lineage, and the crucial question is what exactly changed. Social coercion theory proposes a powerfully useful answer to this question. The change was social. The new social environment subsequently drove all the genetic changes we think of as making us human. To see how this works, let's look briefly at the logic of cooperation in non-human animals. Biological individuals inherently have conflicts of interest, and these are particularly acute between non-kin individuals. Social coercion theory proposes that humans evolved as a unique kind of animal entirely as a result of our unprecedented capacity to manage these universal non-kin conflicts of interest. We were able to do this in turn because of our evolution of the capacity to project coercive threat from a distance, making conjoint social coercion a cost-effective adaptation for the first time, socially enforcing mutual consensual self-interest. By the way, the unprecedented capacity for coercion from a distance apparently first evolved in our lineage with the rise of elite throwing about 2 million years ago, and continues to be essential to our unique social adaptation even today, as illustrated by the crucial role of gunpowder projectile weapons in law enforcement, for example. In such a novel animal, the best available adaptive strategy is to pursue individual self-interest only in those few specific ways that are also confluent with the interests of surrounding coercive non-kin others. This represents a social revolution, resulting in an animal society massive in scale and potentially highly cooperative in its daily function. As foreboding as it might seem that our novel access to cheap coercive threat is what created us as a unique species, we actually use this access to inexpensive coercion to enforce the peace, usually, and to insist on humane behavior from one another, often. This perspective takes a little getting used to. However, it is ultimately richly humane. Indeed, our common humanity becomes a fundamental part of our now ancient biology, not an optional, arbitrary cultural fillip. Moreover, we are positioned to understand inhumanity as a treatable pathology. Our basic biology, speech, and cognitive virtuosity emerges as a direct consequence of this social revolution. This novel biology arises exclusively because we evolved to develop and to function as creatures highly dependent on socially mediated support from many others. For emphasis, we are inherently highly dependent creatures. This fundamentally new biology also includes access to vastly increased streams of culturally transmitted information, making us the planet's first pedagogical animal. Knowledge is central to our ancient biology, not something new and recent. Indeed, this perspective gives us new insight into science as an inductive social process, both powerfully influenced, sometimes even distorted, by our narrow individual interests, yet also capable of producing authentic, sometimes even profound insights under the appropriate circumstances. However, our central concern today is the evolution of our ethical behaviors. For 2 million years, we have been domesticating one another, deciding by mutual consensus the kinds of people we wish to live among. Thus, we have insisted on humane, mutually beneficial behavior from one another. Not always, but often, and under the appropriate circumstances. More about that momentarily. Here today, we've elected to focus on one of the most challenging sets of these humane behaviors to understand from an evolutionary perspective: our capacity to care for disabled people, individuals who, in extreme cases, do not function in a traditional economic or biological sense. This caring behavior seems purely altruistic, something natural selection ostensibly cannot produce. We argue, however, on the one hand, that our unique ancient biology accounts for this ostensibly altruistic behavior, specifically because the approval and support of those around us is the most important adaptive goal for human creatures, unique to us. We are compelled to obey the ethical demands of our larger human communities. Moreover, all of us ultimately experience disability in some sense, either through a relative or individually through disease and injury, and ultimately for all of us, age. And thus we contribute to the consensual enforcement of the care of the disabled from this purely biological perspective. On the other hand, our ever-growing uniquely human knowledge of the biological origins of our behavior puts us in a position to transcend some so-called biological imperatives, allowing us to aspire to and consensually enforce an even richer capacity for mutual concern and care. Joanne will now explore some of the crucial details of how and when we act humanely and when we don't from her disciplinary perspective. Joanne?
Thank you, Paul, and good afternoon. There are 2 points I'd like to make here from the very beginning. The first one is definitional. The terms selfish and self-interested, shown here, are not synonymous terms. Obviously, selfish behavior is when you act in a way that disproportionately rewards your own interests at the cost of the interest of others. Now, this behavior can become extreme, to the point that others are treated inhumanely by those acting selfishly when they have disproportionate access to power. Those behaving selfishly usually believe they actually are justified in behaving that way. Perhaps they think they're genetically superior, or they think they're smarter, or they work harder, or even that they've become ordained by God. In other words, they deserve the highly disproportionate reward that they seek. Selfish behavior under certain environmental conditions can certainly be a subset of self-interested behavior. However, social coercion theory predicts that when credible coercive threat, therefore power, is in the hands of the majority of the population, such selfish behavior is not permitted, and the best alternative strategy to survival in that environment becomes self-interested cooperation. When it's self-interested cooperation, it means that everyone has fair access to credible threat. Therefore, that majority is the entire society is fair to that society, and it becomes and it serves that entire society. Now, depending on the size of the social unit, specializations can even develop in that economy that reward such behavior, such as we could have good schools for everyone's children, we have equal jobs, equal chance at jobs, equal pay for this, depending on gender and disabilities and the elderly. It doesn't matter. Minority status doesn't matter when credible threat is equally distributed in a society. Now, the second point I want to make is that many of us have been taught to believe that male domination and a fiercely hierarchical social, political, and economic system was the norm throughout human history. Social coercion theory predicts just the opposite, that throughout a good portion of our evolutionary history, the human social environment was more or less democratic, with the interests of most of the population served. Sometimes more so, sometimes less so, but depending on the degree of democratic access to a coercive threat. Democracy, therefore, is not a Western ideal, and it is not new. It is actually the ancient human condition. So first, the difference here in this evolutionary tree that Paul showed is that the goodwill and feelings, such as a mammalian mother's love for her offspring, and the cooperation between kin in these animals was expanded to include non-kin in the human lineage. And for the most part, we broke free of this fiercely hierarchical non-human animal system. We became humane humans, for the most part, but with some very specific patterns and conditions. And that happened approximately 1.8 million years ago. However, a fiercely hierarchical system is not just for primates, and we are not immune, or are we completely broken free of it. Evidence supporting social coercion theory, the requirement says that whoever holds credible threat makes the rules, and that can be taken to the extreme, particularly in the archaic state, where coercive threat again fell into the hands of only a minority of the elite male population. However, the problem here is that because written language emerged at this point, history became the lie made up by the winners. And we were taught to believe that this fiercely hierarchical male-dominated system was actually the norm after all. I mean, look at non-human animals. Aren't we like them? No, we're not. It's not true, and the evidence from evolution shows otherwise. To be specific, social coercion theory predicts that when the weapons of law enforcement are democratic in nature and availability, so that the many may cooperate to create a public good, and that public good is not subject to theft from anyone who's physically stronger or more powerful, then the interests of that cooperative unit will be served. This image is only an analogy of how the system would work, forcing the alternative strategy of cooperation upon a would-be cheater to avoid being ostracized. I used a bow here because the bow is easily used, it's relatively easy to make, and it's considered a democratically available weapon. You only needed to shoot an arrow well enough, conjointly with others, to increase the chances that any cheater on the system, no matter how big or strong, would be hurt before you were, even if you dodged. So women, children, the elderly could all participate in enforcing fair behavior. Therefore, their individual interests were served and their individual input was valued. Many times in our evolutionary history, this type of democratic weapon, sometimes it was thrown stones, sometimes the bow, sometimes handguns, but they were available and they were used in this way, making cooperation the best available option. The effect is a much more humane society when the interests of those contributing are served. This statement does not mean that pure democracy and complete humanity is the result. We've bounced back and forth throughout human history between some degree of democracy and some degree of hierarchy. We predict that you will see public humanity in force when the majority of the population has control over credible threat. The public humanity, however, will only cover as much of the population that has the power to enforce it. Some evidence supporting this claim is our obviously humane and ethical feelings. We feel good when we help others. We have a sense that our lives have some higher purpose and that we have feelings of compassion that run very deep. This tells us that such feelings were adaptive in our ancestors at some point, such as those feelings of fairness and ethics were passed down and even honed in us, their descendants. However, our ancestors sometimes lived in fiercely hierarchical social systems when a minority few had control of credible threat. Some of it we're very aware of from our recent history. The archaic state, the times of Hitler, the people controlled by Saddam Hussein where mass murders were commonplace, and even today in North Korea. The inhumanity under these conditions is appalling, and we saw and continue to see public cruelty, intimidation, and inhumanity. However, it is not the time in history. It is not suddenly that we become more genetically evolved not to behave that way. It isn't religion or race that matters. What matters is equal access to credible threat. Our ancestors were adapted to both environments. Each of us also carries the ancestral machinery to survive in those fiercely hierarchical environments as well as we do in democratic environments. So we each can be obedient to authority, passive, and sometimes even cruel. Another set of inherited adaptations. One scientific confirmation that we actually possess alternative strategies is the world-known Milgram experiments. These were done at Yale after the World War when people wanted to understand why the brown shirts and so many other seemingly normal people acted as they did. In this experiment, 40 ordinary men participated, and they were accused of a fierce social hierarchy around them present in the environment. They were assigned the role of teacher and told that every student that gave an incorrect answer to a question were to receive a shock and to raise the level of shock with each incorrect answer. These men acted passive and obedient to authority by following these directions, and they were brutal and abusive to those below them, the students, despite some of them obviously being upset. True, not everyone succumbed, but the majority, 87% of them did. Milgram recognized that it was the cues of the environmental situation that determined the behavior. He said, "The social psychology of this century reveals a major lesson. Often it is not so much the kind of person a man is as the kind of situation in which he finds himself that determines how he will act. Now, it isn't necessary for the choice to be a conscious decision in order for the behavior to manifest itself. In other words, the cues in the environment are picked up by our unconscious, and that behavior is then cued. So it doesn't have to be a conscious choice. Again, something similar was done in California with the famous Zimbardo prison experiments. In this case, some participants were assigned the role of prisoner and others as guards, with all the hierarchical social cues of field authority. These were college students. Again, ordinary college students here, right here in the United States, that were assigned to be guards became abusive, and those assigned to be prisoners, confused and passive. In fact, the experiment had to be stopped because it became so extreme. Zimbardo concluded, only a few people were able to resist the situational temptations to yield to power and dominance while maintaining some semblance of morality and decency. Obviously, I was not among that noble class because he succumbed himself, and he was a student of Milgram's, so he even understood it. But the cues, when they're in the environment, we don't always understand why we act the way we do. So the point here is that we all carry the emotional machinery to survive under democratic and under hierarchical circumstances, depending on the cues that we pick up in the environment. When coercive threat is in the hands of the majority, our societies act in the interests of the majority, including women, minorities, the disabled, and the elderly, as long as they or their kin have access to coercive threat. When coercive threat is in the hands of a few, in order to survive, we can also be passive, and we can also contribute to and even justify inhumane behavior to those still below us. Will some not behave that way? Of course. But what matters is the perception of the best alternative option to the majority of the people. Many will act that way. We've come a long way in our quest to recover from the short part of our history that was fiercely hierarchical in a good portion of the world and return to our ancient, more democratic origins. We've made some progress in reaching more people, but we still have more progress to make. We must be cognizant of the fact that we're designed to act very differently in either environment. So we should carefully monitor and regulate any selfish quest to move to any fierce hierarchy, because we may not even recognize how we're behaving ourselves, and we may just be self-justifying it. At this point, I'd like to introduce Eva Kittay, who will discuss some of the work that still needs to be addressed at this point. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul and Joanne. Title of my paper is Getting from Here to There, Claiming Justice for the Severely Cognitively Disabled. At a conference, a fellow philosopher and bioethicist named Jeff McMahon posed this question to me. The fact that you, Eva Kittay, have a relationship with your daughter doesn't necessarily give other people the same set of reasons that you have to treat your daughter in certain ways. The question is, what is it about people like your daughter that makes moral demands on other people that non-human animals can't make of us? The daughter in question is Sesha. Sesha has severe cognitive disabilities. She's fully dependent on others to care for her and to make sure hers is a flourishing life. For McMahon and for many other philosophers, addressing her needs and wants are exclusively a private matter. Private matter for a family, or in the absence of a family, the business of charity. McMahon is a utilitarian, and this is a philosophy that's shared by figures such as Peter Singer, shown here with his favorite animal, the pig. The question arises for them because they argue that her humanity, my daughter's humanity, her species membership, is no basis for a claim to equal protection or resources. They claim that humans and non-human animals belong in the moral scheme of things. They count in the moral scheme of things. However, they set apart a we we who have special psychological abilities. And these special psychological abilities, such as the ability to anticipate our death, cause us both to suffer more and to derive more happiness than unthinking beings. We are moral persons. This is a moral universe of persons where moral lines are drawn around capacities and not species membership. They call this position moral individualism. Not all humans are included in the moral universe of animals, and if my daughter lacks these higher capacities, she remains at the moral level of a pig or a dog, a non-person. Evolutionary biologists talk about the evolution of capacities, but they do so within the development of a species, not in abstracted moral individualism that McMahon and Singer prefer. McMahon, Singer, and others of their persuasion would rather stick to an implausible just so story with its repugnant consequences for people with certain kinds of disabilities. Now, the question of why humans have obligations to other humans has been answered in another tradition. Philosophers such as Hobbes, Rousseau, no, that's Locke, Rousseau, argued that there was once a natural state out of which we passed, and we made covenants that obligated each of us to each other. Hobbes famously said that the state of nature was a war of every man against every man, in which the life of man is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. And it says, look, life is nasty, brutish, and short, but you knew that when you became a caveman. So we move from our brutish state, our brutish solitary state, to the social contract. Individuals who are roughly equal formed a binding compact that obliged each to each. Philosophers now have long regarded this compact as a historical fiction. So why should a fiction have any moral sway? Well, in our own time, John Rawls has taken the fundamental logical structure of the social contract and recast it in game theoretic terms. We imagine an original position in which each party is rational, independent, is an adult, and these adults are fully functioning, they are mutually disinterested, and they are free and equal. While under a veil of ignorance, where no one knows the particulars of who she or he is, you don't know your social position, you don't know your preferences, these parties, these free, equal, independent parties, choose principles of justice. And these principles of justice, Rawls takes to be an equal liberty principle and a principle that gives fair distribution of the benefits of social cooperation. But all these theories are based on fictions and idealizations. In truth, we are none of the things the theories propose. We are not mutually disinterested, but live our lives enmeshed with those of others, especially those we care about. We come into the world entirely dependent on another. We return to periods of partial or full dependence throughout our lives, and we are never fully independent. The world contains children, people with functional limitations, people who are ill or just too old and frail to be fully functioning. And it contains all those who care for people who are dependent on them in some way, people who themselves become dependent in their work caring for other dependents. These are just so stories that have no place for people like my daughter. So, how next to proceed? An anecdote borrowed from the anthropologist and evolutionary biologist Sarah Hardy is useful at this point. A tourist lost in Vermont asks directions from a local. "If I were aiming to go there," replied the crotchety New Englander, "I would not start out from here." If we are looking for a theory which will not exclude individuals like my daughter, then we cannot get there by starting with these sorts of theories. We need another view of the matter. Sarah Hardy argues that the evidence from anthropology, archaeology, paleontology, anthropology, and evolutionary biology now tells us that our inevitable and long dependency at the start of life made us the only great apes who shared caregiving. Sarah Hardy, in her latest book, discusses this. This is the book Mothers and Others. Along with shared caregiving came developments that allowed hominoids to develop levels of empathy and trust that we do not see in fellow apes, and resulted in a sociality that made human communities with complex social structure possible. It is less our rationality than our empathetic and relational capacities that are foundational for social organization. To think this way is not to start from our independence, but to start from our dependence. We create societies and make political arrangements in good measure precisely because they're the sorts of beings that have extended and recurrent periods of dependency. Starting here, we do not need the just so stories to explain why fully independent beings would ever agree to shed themselves of their liberty and bind themselves to all sorts of duties and obligations to others. To begin with a dependent human being and recognize the pivotal role of the caregiver or dependency worker, we need a public ethic of care that demands that we create social structures that support the care and the development of dependents, basically all of us. Elsewhere, I speak of this as doulia, after the postpartum caregiver, the doula, who cares for the mother so the mother can care for her child. In a public ethic of care, what informs our obligations to one another are connections formed through our connections on our dependence on others. These obligations are between persons who are considered in their connectedness to one another. The only true universal is that we are some mother's child. We each have been nurtured sufficiently to survive the periods of our extreme dependency. Having been the recipient of such care imposes obligations on us. We each owe a debt that is paid back, but it is paid to subsequent generations. There's also a debt that is paid forward in anticipation of the debt we incur if we become dependent or are called upon to care for another. So, now I'm ready to answer McMahon's question. I, as a parent, have obligations to fulfill toward any child of mine. These include preservative love, development, acceptance into society. No parent of a child with typical capacities can do this in a vacuum. We need schools, we need others to babysit, we need others to help out in a variety of ways, as well as to educate and train our children. And one cannot, with any consistency, grant these to one parent and then deny them to another, based solely on the features of the child. One cannot do so because, in the end, we are not merely solitary beings who are a bundle of intrinsic traits, but we are relational beings who depend on one another. No child is simply a parent's own matter, and disability or dependency in no way lessens the obligation. Rather, responding to our needs in our dependence respects the founding principle of social life. Thank you. And next speaker is Pamela Block.
Hi. I'm going to preface my presentation with a mention of the eugenics movement. Eugenics was an early 20th century movement based on the science of improving the human species. Much of the research and policy initiatives came right out of Cold Spring Harbor in Long Island and had a direct impact on disabled people as programs targeted them for institutionalization, sterilization, and euthanasia. So I feel like we're having this entire discussion of human evolution and how we feel about it in the shadow of this legacy. I'm going to begin as a social scientist who focuses on disability studies by defining what is a disability studies approach. And I'm going to go directly to the mission statement of the Society for Disability Studies, which recognizes that disability is a key aspect of human experience, and that the study of disability has important political, social, and economic implications for society as a whole, including both disabled and non-disabled people. Disability studies seeks to augment the understanding of disability in all cultures and historical periods, and to promote greater awareness of the experiences of disabled people and to advocate for social change. This empowerment or rights-based approach developed quite recently. It is based on a clear distinction between the impairment or physical difference and the social experiences that derive directly and indirectly from that difference. I have an image here of a man lying on the ground next to his wheelchair holding a sign that says, "Nursing homes kill." Earlier approaches to explaining or addressing disability, which still coexist today, include religious, moral, or ethical notions of disabled people being cursed or demonic. And I have here an image of a very muscular and fierce-looking man who's crouched on the floor in chains. Also charity. The idea of helping poor souls. And there's an image here of a man in a wagon with a caption that says, "Being unable to walk due to an injured spine, the only income I have is what I receive from you, my dear friends. Your smallest contribution will be appreciated. Thank you. I trust you will not forget it." And finally, we have medical model approaches of fixing broken bodies. And so I have here a picture, a poster for vaccination against polio with two images, one of two children running across the field with a circled text, "this," and then a picture of a girl on crutches with the circled text, "not this." The concept of disabled people having rights and valued sociocultural roles is a significant departure from earlier models and a transformation in the conceptualization of disability from shame to pride, from cursed to valued, and from being viewed as broken puzzles to asserting different ways of being and living in the world. And I have an image here of during a disability rights protest, a young woman in a wheelchair holding a sign that says, "Fix the system, not me." From an anthropological perspective, I'm also considering Ravenau's 1996 discussion that, and I quote, "New forms of biosociality and new ethical technologies are being assembled around the proliferating categories of corporeal vulnerability, somatic suffering, and genetic risk and susceptibility." I'm also looking at Rose and Novus's 2004, and I'm quoting again, use of the term biological citizenship descriptively to encompass all those citizenship projects that have linked their conceptions of citizens to beliefs about the biological existence of human beings as individuals, as families, and lineages, as communities, as population and races, and as a species. How do these concepts function in relation to a disability pride approach? We can easily talk about biosociality and biological citizenship in relation to single diagnosis groups. It gets more complicated thinking about cross-disability activism because the biological basis becomes less important than the shared social experiences. Biocentrism is challenged in disability studies, yet the medical gatekeepers are still there looming in the background. It is a contradiction, and one of many, as we try to understand complex relationships of dependence, independence, interdependence, vulnerability, and pride that constitute modern disability experience. These are important considerations as we witness and participate in struggles for paradigmatic primacy, for resources, for the right to frame questions and determine the so-called answers that emerge to shape policy and practice. And a final image here, a row of disability rights activists. One is carrying an American flag with the stars in the shape of a wheelchair. I suggest that we try to move beyond the simplistic false binaries in the conceptualizations of disability and impairment between cure, making disability go away, and quality of life, living with disability. These fail to encompass the complexity of modern disability experience. And to circle back to the beginning, in considering biosociality and biological citizenship, I want to reflect on the earlier eugenics movement and its attempts to frame disability as something that should be erased entirely. And I want to consider this in the context of how currently, through genetic counseling and genetic engineering, we now have this reality where it is possible to select and even design babies. The full implications of this for disability community, activism, and scholarship are still being explored, and I want to acknowledge my students here today, Gretchen Specht and Amanda Gonzalez, who have jump-started my own thinking processes in this direction. Oh, also the references.
Let me just say that I think one of the things that working with the three of you helped me see, reminded me of what a powerful thing this disciplinary unification really is. Pamela alluded to the legacy of the eugenics movement, for example, how theories of evolution and theories of genetic control of behavior were taken to rationalize elite domination, systematic manipulation of people. The Nazis liked eugenics more than anyone else, for example. And we're an understanding that is for evolutionary biologists to confront what humanists and social scientists already knew. That is that this was not how people actually work. Forced us as people who think about evolution of human beings to think differently about how we look at what we're trying to do. And that's been going on not just in the few months that we've been working together, but for over a decade. This leads me though to a specific question. So my sense, anecdotal sense, and I'd love both Eva and Pamela to comment on this, is that in fact there's a strong correlation between the level of democratization of a culture, that is the extent to which it's an authoritarian state, for example, as opposed to a partially democratized state, and how those states treat the disabled. Is that impression correct?
Well, I would say that it also depends on who gets included in the democratization.
Yes.
Right? I mean, we've had democracies for a long time, but within these democracies, not everyone's been enfranchised. And one of the major elements to all social movements is some kind of enfranchisement and inclusion within that democratic process. I think that's happening, has been happening in the disability movement. There's, in the current UN Convention on Disability, even the convention claims that, asserts that even people with severe cognitive disabilities, any person should have a vote, right? Which is to enfranchise them. And so I think to the extent that you're going to get more enfranchisement, you might get also better treatment.
Yeah, I have to agree with what Eva's saying. I think that certainly hierarchical situations, have less capacity, but being in a democratic situation doesn't necessarily automatically mean that disability is included. I think what we're seeing is relatively recent. It's a recent and a new thing in the world.
Yeah. Perhaps we had to go through a period of extreme hierarchical,
Right.
the incredible treatment of the Nazis of people with disabilities, either sterilizing them or, in the case of people with mental disabilities of any sort, killing them. They were the first to be killed before despised minorities were killed.
That's true, but what really I find striking and I like to point out is that as horrific as the Nazi programs were, they were modeled on policies that were generated right here on Long Island, right? Very close to home. And they were just taken to a far extreme, but very much based on the model policies that were developed here.
So I should emphasize, I think the people at Cold Harbor are quite well aware of that, and they've just published, I think last year, a book making this point that a theory from the natural sciences is just a small thing that has to be tested more broadly. We have to take interdisciplinary unification seriously. In other words, a theory of human evolution isn't valid or useful unless it also is congruent with what humanists and social scientists know to be true. And of course, eugenics was never any such thing. And so I think this awareness that we are joined in this way, and that we have to take one another seriously. Interdisciplinary criticism is not kind of a sort of vague objective. It's an essential part of the knowledge enterprise. And I think biologists actually do recognize that, I think.
There's also the level where we have our ideas and our theories and our science, but once they're out in the world, they're no longer under our control, and they're sometimes used and applied in ways that we don't intend.
Yeah. And of course, the really interesting question is when that happens, that was Joanne's point, is that there's a really consistent pattern that when political power is hierarchically controlled, racism, sexism, the abuse of the disabled are all fundamental characteristics and properties. So these are tools of elite domination.
Well, they'll even take part of the science, for instance, the eugenics movement, and use it as an excuse to behave in a certain way that is in their interest and not in everyone else's. And that will typically happen once a hierarchy or a small group is starting to get power over everyone else. But part of it, as far as the disabilities are concerned, is the organization of people that do care about disabilities, and the organization and the credible threat back, in other words, by the numbers. Because in human history, it always was the numbers that won, mostly if the numbers had access to credible threat. And in the United States, we still basically are a democracy, even though we kind of swing back and forth between the two. So the numbers do matter to us, and I think that the more organization the disabilities have, I think and the more public they are about it, it shows that there is an organization and there are a good many people that care about this. And in a democracy, that does matter.
I think I would add one sort of little additional feature to that. I think it's something that both natural scientists and I think humanists and social scientists looking at natural scientists haven't recognized, I think until now, that is, science is not something that was invented in the last several hundred years, or even in Greece 2,000 years ago. It's a 2-million-year-old human social process. And science works to the extent that we don't allow it to be monopolized by a few specialists. Those specialists are useful in generating insights that the rest of us look at. But it is the democratized inspection, criticism, policing of what scientists, or for that matter humanists and social scientists, discover that turns it into authentic knowledge. I think that's the most important way in which democracy impacts the knowledge enterprise.
Well, I would also say that it matters who's doing the researching. science, for all its claims for objectivity, still fails to look in certain corners if the people who are doing the science never even noticed those corners.
Absolutely.
So we have a very different view of primatology once women entered into primatology and began looking at very different aspects of primate behavior. I think that the views of evolutionary biologists also have changed in response partly to the different kinds of researchers who are included. So again, democracy here also has to be a democratization of the scholarly world, the research world as well, to make to give us a knowledge that is really going to be truer.
Yeah, I'd like to say one of the predictions of social coercion theory is that the more people that contribute to the knowledge enterprise, the more adaptively sophisticated we actually become. So that you only have a few contributing, your adaptive sophistication can only go so far. And there was a big push at some point, I think some of you may have read the book Half the Sky, that if we leave out the women in the world, then you're leaving out all this input that you could have to increase the knowledge enterprise and to increase adaptive sophistication. I think one of the points that Pamela was making is that the disabled also have a lot to give here that should be valued. And they do have something to give to the knowledge enterprise, and they should be included in that. It's not just a group of people that needs to be taken care of, that they also can contribute to the knowledge enterprise. And maybe if we included more people, we actually could get ahead and solve problems that we aren't able to solve right now. The more heads put together cooperatively, the more problems we can actually solve.
Well, and we teach one another from our perspectives, and disabled people often have really unique perspectives. I think every one of us in this panel, and probably almost everyone in the room, has had direct contact with some kind of disabled person or another. And in my particular case, and I think it probably be true of the other three of us, it changes forever the way you look at what it means to be human, the way you think of how your mind and your body works. That's a priceless lesson, one that you really can't learn anywhere else. Let me return, if I may, to the point Eva made. I could not agree more. Every individual scientist, or for that matter, every individual humanist or social scientist, but certainly every individual natural scientist is myopic by nature. That is how we are. We are rescued from our myopia, or even our malice in the case where that arises, only by being monitored by others, by being watched by others. So in fact, one of the important movements in the natural sciences is to make the fruits of the natural sciences generally available. Don't treat them as esoteric things that a few priests know about, but in fact things that everybody knows about. Because that's the point at which our individual myopia is, we're pulled out of that by everyone else saying, wait a minute, what did you say? What do you mean by that? How do you know that? I can't overemphasize that. I mean, Eva, you are exactly right. But and part of the antidote is to get more people into science. But the other part is that everybody should be watching what we do skeptically and questioning what we do, not just in sciences, but in the humanities and social sciences as well.
And this
Yes,
is an important,
that's true.
it is an important facet of disability studies, and in fact, in disability rights and disability studies, the rallying cry is nothing about us without us, and the gaze is often directly put on science and medical science in particular to say, there are other ways of considering disability other than, objectifying body parts.
Yeah.
And in fact, I mean, this is there's some syndromes that respond very poorly to the medical treatments that are available, but these same people receiving really good care, and by care I don't just mean being passively cared for, I mean being valued and being respected and having your capacities developed, will live way past the time that they would have been expected to live. There was the belief that people with Downs could not live past childhood. People with Down syndrome today live into their late 50s, even 60s. And only part of that are medical innovations. Very little of it is actually medical
It's the
innovations.
social care, am I
It's
understanding?
it's the willingness to treat the folks for whatever medical condition there are, to treat infections. You know, people with Down syndrome were allowed to die, figuring that their lives weren't going to be that good anyway. So these are, we might think of these as great advances in medicine, but it's really advances in attitudes.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
beyond even the treatment of biomedical infections, a lot of the data collected about the lifespans of individuals with Downs was based on institutionalized people. So that doesn't do much to your lifespan to live in an institution. But so, in other words, to sort of build on what you were saying, being in the community, being a part of the community, being part of sort of human life in, in typical contexts, makes a difference.
So we've been monopolizing the microphones here. If you have questions or comments, we would love to hear them.
Thank you very much for this panel. It was extremely interesting. We got a few accounts of how human beings developed these expanded capacities to expanded senses of obligation to others and capacities to care for others. I have a question that's directed for any or all of you. How do we cultivate in ourselves and in our community members further expansions of our capacity to care and further senses of obligation to people with disabilities in particular?
I guess I'll tell you my first thought is that as Americans, we need to address this at the level of national politics. I think that's extraordinarily important because it's very difficult to struggle at the level of local communities in the face of hostile and different state and federal government. So I'd be interested in others' thoughts about this, but I think the recent election and the things that are around this is sort of reassessment of kind of free market fundamentalism, for example, things that tend to treat people as commodities. I think these are really fascinating developments, movements away from a sort of 30-year hiatus into elite financial domination of the political system. I think it's really important getting us to come back and address exactly these questions. As citizens of what is ostensibly a democracy, what are our obligations to one another? These are profound and central questions, not just to this country, but to all of human existence, all time. You could argue that it is the central question. What are we doing here? What's the point of all of this? I'm considerably older than you are, and I remember at your age being deeply frustrated at how slow it is, how slow the process of changing this massive ship of state is. But I also remember how frustrating it was to try to fly in the face of that, acting only locally. So I think we're going to get 4 different opinions here. But my opinion is, don't act only locally. That is, get involved in national and even international action, because ultimately the power of these massive governmental entities is so large that we need to change their course if we're to change the course of our lives.
I want to quote two women I met in Sweden when I was at a conference. This was during the period of restructuring. And even Sweden was cutting back on some of its social services. Sweden has some of the very best policies toward people with disabilities, and all the Nordic countries. Denmark has some really innovative work of how to deal with people with Alzheimer's. And by the way, in talking about disability, we have to remember that with this gift we have of longevity comes dementia. So we are facing a problem of great long-term care. And unless we can get our heads around the issue of care, we're going to really be in trouble. So I was telling these two little old Swedish ladies walking in the park, that we were here for a conference on welfare. And they were saying, in Sweden, they're cutting back too. It's terrible. We should be able to care for one another. We should be able to take care of each other. That's what we have to be able to cultivate. An idea that we have to be able to take care of one another. The United States is particularly difficult place to introduce these ideas because the idea of independence is such a powerful notion here. Now, of course, we all like to do things for ourselves. I like to call it efficacy, being effective, or self-efficacy as the psychologists call it. And that's fine, but the idea that you are nothing if you become dependent is an awful view. And as I say, particularly as we live longer and we get to that period in our lives when we cannot do what we used to be able to do, and we do need help, and we need to be able to understand how to accept help when we need it. How to change attitudes, that takes a lot of doing on many different levels.
The recognition that some politicians, let me just add one comment to Evans. The recognition that some politicians think that 47% of Americans are disabled is quite illuminating in this respect. I'm sorry.
As a cultural anthropologist, I have to say it is quite a challenge to think about how do we enact cultural change. I mean, I mentioned in my talk all of the different contradictory models of disability that have evolved over time and still kind of coexist: charity, religious, medical, and new pride-based approaches. And it is encouraging to see, we're such a visual culture, that there are so many, that the images, the representations, the performances, the films that are, providing alternatives to the sort of traditional stereotypes. We have dance companies like Sins Invalid, and we have, films that are coming out, like the sessions that are, really kind of pushing older boundaries. So, we can see it happening, even though it may not be happening as quickly, as we'd like, or as completely as we'd like.
I'd like to go back more to the, as Paul would say, the higher end side of it, where if you have a hierarchical society, what tends to happen is that the society is forced to serve the interests of those that are on the high side of the hierarchy. So what you have is those jobs, basically, that serve them, that serve their interests, are going to be the ones that are treated the best. And the rest of them are going to be downplayed as if they're not important. So anything that does not serve the interests of the elite will not be considered a very good job to have. Therefore, to change people's attitudes, you need to have it so that, again, democracy is distributed throughout the population. And then what tends to happen is we start to get jobs start to actually come to be that take care of people, and we're allowed to care. We don't have to sell out to make a living, basically, and go to jobs that are just serving the elite interests. We then have a chance to do what we really would love to do and what we care about. Then we can do that without having to sell out to the interests of the elite or join a job, say get a job in finance because it's the only thing that's paying anything. We can become teachers, we can become caregivers, and we still can make a living. Unfortunately, that doesn't happen in a society that's controlled by any elite interest group. The only jobs that pay well are going to be the ones that serve them.
Yes, the notion that wages and profits are the process of impersonal market forces is extraordinarily naive. Markets are rigged games, rigged by the rules defined by policy. And so it's up to us to define the policies that we want to define the markets that we have. In other words, it comes back to us asking the question, what are our obligations to one another? So I think we'll stop there, but we'd love to I'm sorry, is there one more question? I'm sorry, excuse me.
Because contemporary genetics will be significantly decreasing the amount of children born with a disability, and as a result, fellow citizens will have less experience with people who experience a disability, do you think that the rights or care-based advocacy work will lose ground?
I actually don't think so. There's been a very interesting epidemiologist study that looked at the population of people with cognitive disabilities from the time in the 60s when the Kennedys got involved, the Kennedy Foundation got involved, and their aim was to eradicate cognitive disability. And of course, being able to identify the phenomenon is already difficult because the labels change, who gets attached to those labels changes, but taking all these kinds of considerations into account, it was a very careful study. He concluded that, in fact, the number of people with cognitive disabilities from the 1960s to now have not changed. And they haven't changed because even as we do some things to eradicate the disability, there are new procedures that actually create the disabilities, right? So while we're busy testing to make sure that our fetuses don't have any disabilities, we're also busy trying to keep younger and younger neonates alive. And a lot of people with cognitive disabilities today are a consequence of those kinds of features. Also, there are hazards in our environment that we are not identifying. We're not quite sure what the reason for more and more people with autism, though it's not sure if that's just questions of labeling or if it's a real epidemic. So I am not, I don't think we're going to get to a point where, we may have less people with Down syndrome. On the other hand, of all the disabilities, cognitive disabilities, Down's has probably been represented in the most favorable light. There are movies, there are, they figure as models, folks with Down figure as models in certain ad campaigns. And I think there are, I don't know, but my sense is that there'll be a little bit more hesitancy about aborting a fetus with Downs. But I think what's happening is also that people are bringing people with disabilities, who are sort of on the back porch, coming out on the front porch. And, that's teaching us that life with disability can be a good, flourishing life, if the circumstances allow it.
Let me just add one small thing as a professional biologist. I think one of the things that's really startling that's emerged from the genetics, the real progress in genetics in the last decade, is how complex the genetic basis of most of these things are. We were all hoping that things like the sickle cell model for sickle cell anemia would apply to things like schizophrenia, say, or autism. And in general, that has not been the case. So what we're seeing is extraordinarily complex interactions between many different genetic markers, each contributing a small amount, with idiosyncratic environmental circumstances. So I think that the notion that we're going to be able to impact this problem in a large way in the next generation, I think, is illusion. I don't think we will. We have a long way to go.
If we want to walk down that road.
If we want to walk down that road, which is an interesting question in its own right. All right, thank you very much. It was a pleasure. Thank you for your attention.